Thanks for asking. Tonight, 6:40 with El Paso. Yeah.
Please don't preface your questions with a lot of opinion. Be careful with that. Really all I'm asking for is the question that you want to ask. You don't have to kind of embellish because it makes it a little bit more difficult to define what exactly the question is. Doctor, the jury has some questions of you. And again, all of this is whether you feel that you're capable of responding or not.
Yes, sir.
Right, so I believe that your testimony earlier was officers fire rounds at the rate of approximately 4 rounds per second until they perceive that the threat has stopped. The question is that perception can be very subjective as it varies with the individual. What does the training of police officers direct them to do in terms of reacting to the perception of a threat? Does the training indicate that the magazine should be, is it permissible to empty a magazine even when the threat no longer exists? If it existed at the beginning, how far can an officer, from your experience, go in terms of eliminating the threat?
An officer, whether it's deadly force or use of a baton or use of a chemical spray or any level of force, by law is only allowed to use that level of force for as long as is necessary to gain compliance or to end a threat. You cannot continue using force or it becomes what's called excessive force. If someone were to empty their magazine, say fires, if they have a 15-round magazine and one in the chamber, for them to shoot 16 rounds, but they're having perceived much earlier that the deadly force no longer, that the threat no longer existed, that would be excessive force, and that would be unlawful.
All right, thank you. Can intoxication cause a law enforcement officer to exaggerate a perceived threat?
That's a really good question. I'd just be giving my opinion because I think, as I mentioned, there is no scientific study on intoxicated officers in deadly force confrontations. My belief and my opinion is that intoxicants of any kind distort judgment. And I think people will make more frequent misjudgments when they're under the influence of an intoxicant like alcohol than they would if they were not.
Again, based on potential intoxication, again, the question earlier was whether they can exaggerate a perceived threat, or as a follow-up, not recognize when the threat has ended. Can it have an impact on that?
I think all kinds of potential misjudgments can occur. I think you can have misjudgments where they underperceive threat because they're intoxicated. They don't see things that they normally would alert to what the question, what was embedded in that question, to misperceive and not recognize when the threat has ended. So I think there's a full range of potentially distorted judgments when people are under the influence.
Are law enforcement officers trained to chase or pursue a perceived threat?
Yes. I think, there's always qualifications to every answer, but if a law enforcement officer is dealing with a subject who he or she perceives as a deadly threat to him or to others, that officer is going to chase that person in order to assure public safety, even if there's no longer any imminent threat to that officer.
The jury is asking whether, if you can please explain what they consider to be a little bit of conflict in the testimony that you provided, that a law enforcement officer can fire around a round every 0.25 seconds, and the PowerPoint slide that was used during the course of the testimony that indicates it takes an officer 0.54 seconds to fire a round. I believe that there is those two representations. The latter one, I believe, dealt with as an individual is turning around. I believe it was on that demonstrative exhibit.
I apologize for the confusion. The slide with the officer who fired around at 0.54 seconds, that's how long it takes on average for an officer in that position to react to a shot being fired and fire his first round. If that officer had continued to fire, that officer would fire one shot every 0.25 seconds.
Okay, let me see if I can formulate the question here. Part of your testimony or the discussion was related that it takes a while to cease the response to a perceived threat. And I think the examples that we're using, that's why additional bullets are perhaps spent or discharged, even perhaps after the threat has been eliminated. One of the examples that you gave was a vehicle. A vehicle, to stop it, you have to apply force. Here with a gun, it's just releasing your finger from the trigger, and it automatically stops, where the vehicle potentially continues on. And it takes more of an effort to stop that. The question is, how do you explain that a bullet cannot be stopped once it leaves the muzzle? So I believe that the question that's being asked is, how do you explain the fact that, again, it takes so much less of an effort to stop firing the gun?
The point that I was trying to make is that we all know what reaction time is to start an action, but I think most of us don't think about the same phenomena on the tail end of our action. It takes a similar amount of time to stop action. That's just the nature of the way the brain perceives, okay, there's no longer any reason for me to fire. But remember, the officer has started firing. They've started firing 4 rounds per second. They're already engaged in an action. So they have to first perceive that the threat is no longer there. Sometimes there are distractors to that. Oftentimes officers can't tell if the rounds have hit the subject that they're firing at. They don't necessarily see any visual evidence of it, particularly if people are clothed. Oftentimes people mortally wounded will continue to fight, continue to move. So the basic message I was trying to get across is, in any action, be it a shooting, that's why they have yellow lights and traffic lights, because it takes a while for us to react. If it just went from a green light to a red light, a lot of us would be going through red lights and would be getting in accidents. So, and that's entirely because it takes all of us time to perceive a signal that we no longer need to continue the action that we're taking. So, hopefully that's clear.
Let's see, are psychologists that are board certified able to practice anywhere, or are you